All right, so go ahead, Brad, and take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining this evening. And when Matt asked for a title, I just kind of tongue-in-cheek sent him taking a turn for the worse. It's not just an idiom, but after thinking about it and going through some of the slides and thinking about the outcome of some of these projects, it seemed like a kind of a fitting title. So I'll try not to end on a down note, but certainly talking about terns and endangered species in Illinois can be a little bit of a challenge. So, okay. So when you think about the endangered and threatened birds in Illinois, there are about 29 species that are state listed currently. And if you look at the distribution of those species, many of them are associated with wetlands. About 19 of the 29 species are associated with wetlands. But what's even more striking is 4 of the species that are currently listed as threatened or endangered are actually tern species. The least tern being federally listed as endangered, and then the common tern, the Forster's tern, and the black tern, those are listed as endangered in Illinois only. And so when you consider the endangered and threatened species of Illinois, the terns are a pretty significant component of that list. And they really hold a common element amongst the birds because of the nesting habitat is in direct conflict with many human activities, in particular because these birds are associated with shores and wetlands. So there's a lot of conflicts, especially near their nesting colonies. So these would be the tern species that have occurred in Illinois. The Caspian tern is not listed by NatureServe or any of the other agencies in terms of any kind of concerns. There is one known nesting colony that nests on a rooftop near the mouth of the Chicago River, which is relatively unique. The Arctic tern has been seen probably 3 or 4 times here in Illinois on some of the big lakes down by Springfield and Hennepin Hopper, and one of the sites that I'll be talking about is the Great Lakes Naval Training Center. So those two, the Caspian and the Arctic, do occur here in Illinois. The Caspian doesn't nest in large numbers or in distribution, but it's really not a species of special concern. So what I'm really going to focus on tonight are the least tern, the Forster's tern, the black tern, and the common tern. And again, these are 4 species that nest here in Illinois, and 4 that are listed as state endangered. Starting out with the Forster's tern, this is a species its distribution is throughout the Midwest on large freshwater lakes. We're here in Illinois with the arrows pointing, so we're just sort of outside the major breeding distribution of the Forster's tern. So we have had several colonies that have nested here in Illinois, and those species, or the nesting sites where those have been nesting, has been at the Chain of Lakes State Park and Fourth Lake and Elizabeth Lake. Those 3 sites were historically known to have nesting colonies of Forster's tern. And this is the type of habitat where they nest, like I say, these larger inland lakes with some very extensive emergent. And this is just kind of an interesting thought about what the nesting habitat was like historically here in Illinois. And this is just a writing that I took from E.W. Nelson back in 1876. And they were actually out at Chain of Lakes. And I'll just read through it real quickly here. It's, although I've been aware that Sterna fosteri, that's the Forster's tern, has nested in this vicinity for several years, it was not until the middle of June of 1876 that I had the pleasure of examining one of their nests while we were collecting eggs among the wild rice patches of Grass Lake. And so you have to envision that the northern half of Grass Lake was a vast wild rice patch, and there's historically they talk about flocks of ducks that would take days to land and feed on the wild rice. So this was quite a wilderness area, the Grass Lake, that part of the Chain of Lakes State Park. But Mr. Douglas observed a pair of these terns hovering near a small patch of Sagittaria leaves growing in several feet of water, and rowing to the spot found the nest, which was loosely built of reeds resting upon a mass of floating plants. Upon the side of the nest was a single young bird about to scramble into the water, but upon seeing Mr. Douglas, crouched to avoid being observed and was captured. A thorough search failed to reveal any other young ones, so the adults, which had been darting and screaming about his head, were secured, together with a second pair, which had espoused the cause of their companions. So this is actually somebody who's out there collecting Forster's terns. And so these are specimens that show up in private collections. Back then, it was quite common for people to collect eggs and birds. Audubon and others who are noted for going out, and you think about the photography or the images that they've been painting, but most of those are because they've actually collected these birds. And just a little bit further, just talk about, they observed 4 small heaps of wild rice stalks resting upon a mass of decaying vegetable matter, and on nearer view, to my delight, they proved to be desired nests containing eggs. The only materials used were pieces of wild rice stems. The nests were quite bulky, being 2 feet or more in diameter. While near the nest, the birds were circling high overhead, now and then uttering a harsh cry. But concealing myself in the rice nearby, I soon secured several of the parent birds as they flew about the nest, uttering cries at the spoliation of their treasures. After the first bird fell into the water, the others showed the usual sympathy of their kind. But as the 3rd or 4th specimen was killed, the remainder cautiously withdrew. So he's actually talking about going out and collecting many of these Forster's terns. And again, those were all maintained in private collections. And then ultimately, a lot of those private collections went into the museums where they have been used for studies subsequently. But this was Grass Island about 50 years after that writing. And this is actually I don't know if, I hopefully you can see my cursor, but this is actually the Fox River, where it comes through the Chain of Lakes State Park and empties into the north end of Grass Lake. And this was an island where where he talks about rowing out in amongst the wild rice patch. And this was actually historically known. People would come from Europe and paddle through this northern part of Grass Lake, where the lotus beds were collected for the perfume. And you can see that this is just an extensive patch, even 1939, of emergent vegetation. Unfortunately, when we look at Grass Lake in 1998 here on the right, you can see that island that is highlighted on the left is just 2 small little segments, and there's no emergent vegetation whatsoever. So all the agricultural runoff of pollutants, the sedimentation, the boat traffic, dredging, and most importantly, the construction of the McHenry Dam changed the hydrology of this area permanently. And so no longer do we have those extensive emergent vegetations where the Forster's terns were nesting. So this was the last time that in 1995 that there was a colony in Grass Lake that was nesting on the island that had been used for hundreds of years. So this was the last photograph of this colony. And what ended up happening is, again, just through all the boat traffic, the erosion, high water levels, this is all that was left of that island that was historically used for Forster's terns in 2000. So I went back and all the records I can find here in Illinois, and a lot of the reports just talked about the number of nests or reported seeing the terns nesting or general observations of the nest, not too much. I wouldn't take a whole lot of, I guess, using some of the number of the young. I don't think the observations of those records was very specific related to the young. There's one in 1995 that was I was pretty confident of the numbers, but for the most part, it just kind of gave an idea of the numbers that were nesting. So you can see in 1997 was about the last time that the colony was nesting in Grass Lake. About the same time, the Fox Waterway Agency was trying to figure out a place to put their dredge spoil. So they talked about doing an artificial island using these geotubes. And basically they were going to use this hydraulic dredge and fill these big 50-foot long tubes full of sediment, and then they would hydraulically pump the dredge material into the island. And unfortunately, it started out as just a single acre test plot, and it kind of got out of hand, and they ended up building a 35. This is a 35-acre structure, so it was a lot bigger than we knew we could manage. But we were dealt a hand, I guess, the politics of wanting to have places to put the dredge spoil. But basically, the island at this point where the terns nested was gone. And so we picked the location right along the edge here where there's able to walk out onto the island. And we thought we would try to do what was called conspecific attraction and try to attract the terns back to this nesting island where they historically nested. So we went out and throughout Grass Lake and cut down all the duck blinds that were there. They have to be taken out by January 1st. And so any of the remaining duck blinds, we kind of utilized all the willows and the cuttings and kind of piled them up and try to create an island inside this protected zone of these geotubes. And this is kind of what it looked like, where we put all the mats and the construction material that had been left behind for the winter. And then we used some models of somewhat looked like Forster's Tern, certainly not the best decoys in the world, but we constructed some decoys. And then most importantly, we had these call boxes that were run on these solar panels so that we could have the calls of nesting Forster's Tern calling in the background. So this conspecific attraction, this is kind of what we had to going with, just a small cattail island that was protected from the waves and the activities out on the lake. And you can see the decoys and the call boxes. And within the first few weeks of spring migration, pairs of Forster's Terns probably passing through on their way back to Wisconsin, several pairs stopped in and were attracted to the site. And before long, going through the courtship behavior, and we knew that we were going to be successful in attracting the birds back to nesting in one of their long historic sites. When we saw the birds carrying food, we knew that the young had hatched and they were coming back. And this chick still has an egg tooth on, so it was still newly hatched young. And within just a few days, we had large numbers of fledglings running around inside the island. And so we were very excited about the possibility of actually returning this colony. And as part of the project, we wanted to go out and try to look at return rates and survival. So we gathered up the young when they're old enough to band and applied leg bands to all the young that we could capture. And sure enough, these young birds as subadults, after hatching from Chain of Lakes, most of them are actually seen up along Milwaukee and north. They traveled out onto the Lake Michigan and then headed north after fledging. So we were pretty excited about the project and the prospects of getting the Forster's Terns returned to a nesting species in Illinois. And we were very fortunate. There's Donnie Dan, who's been with me for many years chasing these terns, and his name will come up several times in this presentation. But this island seemed to really be attractive. It was shallow water, emergent vegetation, and protected from the boat traffic, and it was very attractive for the first few years that the geotube was up, and even during active hydraulic dredging, the birds really flocked to this area and found it a very resource-rich area in which to feed and rest on migration. Unfortunately, the Chain of Lakes is known as the highest boating mortality in the country. There's a lot of activity at night, a lot of high-speed boating. There's a bar next door, Blarney's Island. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, but it was really difficult to try to manage this island as part of the state park and keep it separate from all the boating activity. And the second year we had this, the Tern colony going quite strongly, or quite well established. A boat hit this at high speed and landed right in the middle of the colony, and the birds dispersed, and we were picking up dead birds for days after that event. So that was the start of the downfall of the Grass Lake colony. In subsequent years, we had flooding events that topped over everything, washed away the nesting platforms and the structures. We had continual problem with people accessing the site despite signage and buoys and everything. We just couldn't keep the people away, and the vegetation. It was such a large island, we couldn't manage the vegetation anymore, and we were concerned. We were just had created an attractive nuisance at that time, that the birds were finding suitable place to nest, but with the amount of disturbance and the boating activities and the number of boats that were going into the island, we ended up deciding that was no longer a good place to try to attract the birds to nest. So during those few years that we did have the birds coming back and nesting, we were relatively successful, but again, we determined that we just couldn't manage the site in a way that was going to be conducive to safely raise clutches year after year. And so we no longer maintain that. There were some other sites. We had a master's student, Cindy Jablonski, who's now with the McHenry County Conservation District. She was helping with some of the work we were doing with Fourth Lake and Elizabeth Lake, doing some of this kind of specific attraction. And we got some birds that would come into those sites. They weren't quite as subject to the amount of human disturbance, but we just couldn't maintain the nesting structure and the viability of those colonies. And so subsequently, we consider the Foster's tern extirpated from Illinois. There are no longer any nesting colonies here. The common terns, again, another species that's listed as state endangered. And this is very different than the Foster's terns in terms of habitat. They like sandy and rocky shorelines that are very sparse vegetation, so in stark contrast. And yet these areas also are very subject to high human interference and disturbance in their nesting sites, especially they're nesting on the ground in this exposed sand and cobble. And those are the high recreation uses. Again, here in Illinois, we're really on the southern expanse of their breeding range. Most notably, people are probably more familiar with these species nesting along the eastern coast, but they also nest in large inland freshwater lakes where there's sandy and gravel beaches without the human disturbance. The common terns have always been nesting in Illinois for historically have known to nest in Illinois, but always in small numbers. There's never been large colonies or large distribution throughout Illinois, and mostly just noted along the Lake Michigan shoreline, most notably a nesting colony at Waukegan, another one at Midwest Generation, which is the big power plant in Waukegan, and then at Johns Manville, which is the asbestos Superfund site, which is just north of the Midwest Generation. So you can see that the terns have nested in small numbers and somewhat consistently, and then they kind of blipped out for a while. There are no noted records of nesting for a while until about 1997. And when we looked at some of the records and the data going back, old Meadowlark journals and ornithological journals notes, people always talking about how young were banded, and days later dogs had apparently come in and carried off the young. Nests were being destroyed by dogs. Since they're nesting on the ground, predators such as skunks and raccoons are very well known to walk off with young and eggs. And so even during the nesting attempts that were reported on, most of those ended in failures because of high rates of nest predation. One of the sites, again, the Midwest Generation, which has been kind of sold back and forth over the years, so ComEd or Midwest Generation, is the big coal-fired plant right on the lakeshore. We noted that the terns were nesting on a big settling basin. And my predecessor, Amy Horstman, worked with Donnie Dan and identified the site and worked with ComEd, and were able to build a fence around this colony in hopes that the colony could be protected from the predation by coyotes and foxes and raccoons, etc. So they put the electric fence, and the first year was extremely successful. Unfortunately, after that, we got a call from Donnie one day and said, all the birds are gone. There's no birds there. So we went out and checked in the colony and found a common tern there, and the breast mussels had all been eaten out. And then we looked up on the smokestacks of the nearby power plant, and there was the pair of peregrines that had been reintroduced there. So here we had a species of the peregrine falcon at the time was a listed species, and efforts were being undertaken to try to reintroduce that species and increase the populations. But unfortunately, came in direct conflict with our efforts to increase another endangered species, the common tern. So this colony kind of bounced around a little bit. They tried to nest in some of the area of John Mansville that at the time was being raised, and so those nests were eaten by skunks and raccoons with all the human activity there. And then got a call, and somebody had mentioned they had seen the terns down at the Naval Station, Great Lakes. And so I went out to the colony and or the area that we thought they might be nesting in, and it looked like ideal habitat, again, sandy beaches with sparse vegetation. And sure enough, we found some nests, but they'd all been destroyed. And we realized that that island was being used by the naval training cadets to go out and do their maneuvers and drills. And so 150 people at a time would go running through the nesting colony. And certainly it was nothing intentional. They had no idea the birds were nesting there, that they had never nested there previously. And so the Navy, working with the Department of Defense, were just spectacular. Bob Bendigon and more recently Matt Woolert with the Department of Defense and Naval Station Great Lakes were very supportive of our efforts to try to protect this area. And so we were able to put up some fencing and some electric fencing to keep the raccoons and the skunks and the predators away. And so we were very successful in establishing electric fence around the colony, trying to enhance the vegetation there. So there's sparse vegetation they're suitable for, and attracted large numbers of the common terns nesting. And so we were very excited about able to have a place that was actually off limits to the public, so we can control human activities. And we really had some real high expectations of this nesting colony. And sure enough, year after year, we had the birds returning, and we could modify the nesting habitat to what we thought would be the optimum nesting habitat. And we had some really good years of chicks hatching out and some high hatching success. During those years, when the birds are old enough to ban, we were able to ban those birds. And again, we put on colored markings so that we could identify the birds from a distance and try to look at cohorts to see what years the birds would return. And again, a lot of these birds, some of the subsequent sightings were up in Wisconsin along the lakefront, migrating north after fledging. So we got some information about distribution. During this time, again, we were trying to keep out the skunks and the raccoons, but having this type of nesting structure out in the open sand was also very conducive for the gulls. So we had large numbers of ring-billed gulls trying to nest in the colony. And so trying to chase the gulls away and not chase the terns away, we use some innovative approaches to driving after just the gulls and steering around the terns, and it worked quite well trying to keep the gulls out of the colony. The coyotes did pose a problem. They would jump over our fences, and so after a while we had to build bigger and better fences, and pretty soon we called this Stolic 13, that trying to keep out everything we possibly could to try to increase the success of this nesting colony. And so you can see that over the years, the number of nesting attempts was relatively moderate. And once we started providing suitable nesting habitat that was protected from mammalian predators, it was quite successful. We're very encouraged with the numbers. And what we're really encouraged with is if you looked at the 25 years of records of this tern colony and the number of young hatched, we had about 2 times the number of young in just 5 years over the previous 25 years. So we were very excited about what was going on here. Unfortunately, after those first few years of very good success, we recognized the fact that we were having relatively stable numbers of pairs that were coming into nest, but the number of young that were successfully hatching kept dropping off. And we were really concerned about what was going on. And we were very fortunate. We partnered up with Mike Ward from the University of Illinois, and we had a graduate student, Cindy Jablonski, who was very interested in following up. She was actually involved with the Forster's Terns, and so was familiar with Terns, and decided to take on a master's program with the common Terns. And what we were finding is the chicks, the adults were laying these eggs and incubating successfully, but then the day of or the day after hatch, many, if not most, all of the chicks were dying. And so we started to look at the possibility of toxicology issues. And so we did some widespread screening of some potential toxins that the birds might come in contact with. And we saw that just incredible concentrations of PCBs, and not only the eggs, but the small young and some of the food items that they were bringing back. And this was coincided with the time period when Waukegan was dredging out and dealing with the PCB contamination up in the harbor of Waukegan Harbor. And we feel during this time they were really churning up the water as they were excavating, and then before they laid the clay layer and try to line the harbor to try to minimize the amount of PCBs. We felt as though the PCBs were really impacting significantly the success and the hatchability of the young terns. At the same period of time, as we said, we started with this sort of an island or the peninsula where these birds are nesting, but the lake levels started coming up. And so the birds try to react to this. And I've never seen common terns nesting in actually these floating reed structures before, but they were trying to raise their nest up off the sandy substrate that they're used to, and they're actually adding material as the water levels are coming up. And so it might have been somewhat fortuitous that this is our nesting island, but the birds ended up leaving, and we felt it might have been actually, once again, just like those Forster's terns, it might have been an attractive nuisance, that we had a good nesting site, a protected nesting site from the predators. And yet, because of the PCBs, we were attracting them to an area that we knew that they weren't successfully raising young. So we tried to move the nesting colony north of Waukegan Harbor, thinking that the PCBs were drifting southward with the littoral drift. And so we thought it might be a safer place to be foraging north of Waukegan Harbor. So we made an attempt to try to lure the birds, again, with this conspecific attraction up to the Zion nuclear power plant that we felt there might be safer foraging area. But the birds had their own ideas, and so they actually went down south, further south, and went down to Waukegan Beach. And here they set up their nest in the sparse vegetation of the dunes. And as soon as we learned about the establishment of a nesting colony, we tried to rope it off, try to work with the city officials to see if we could try to protect this colony. And so by the time we learned about this nesting colony, I was able to get electric fence around. Here they are, they're just nesting on the top of this dune. Unfortunately, Waukegan Beach at the time, we didn't have a good working relationship with the administration. We try to kind of close the beach off and try to get people, keep them away from the nesting site. But we were learning on the weekends, busy times, or when the winds were coming, the kite surfers were there. Their kites were actually flying over the colony. People were going in, damaging the electric fence, and unfortunately lost that tern colony right away. Since then, we've had Save Our Shores, Audubon group that's just been wonderful to work with, and working with the city administration. And we feel that if the birds do return to this area, or the piping plovers return to this area, we've got little bit of a head start, and kudos to the Saving Our Shores and the Audubon group that's working to really work with the beach users there to see if we can get the compatibility between the birds and the recreational uses. So again, just chasing these common terns up and down Lake Michigan, we tried one more effort to, the birds were actually started to go back to Great Lakes Naval Station, and they were nesting on the docks and on some of the boats. So we knew they wanted to nest there. Previously, I had collected some eggs from tree swallows, and we didn't see the PCB levels that we had previously in the terns. We thought the cleanup efforts at Waukegan had come to a close and were very successful in reducing the PCBs. So we actually refurbished this is actually some floating dock that was taken out of Moraine Hill State Park. We had some Boy Scouts help refurbish this into a floating dock. Again, we use the decoys. These are actually some of the leftover decoys from the Foster's terns, and try to establish these floating rafts, nesting rafts for the terns. Literally within days of putting out this floating raft, we had the terns landing and establishing clutches of eggs on these floating rafts. So we're really excited that we could prevent the mammalian predators. There was no more cadets running through the nesting colony, and we felt very confident we had a pretty secure area. And the birds, the first year, were very successful in establishing the eggs and raising them up. And toward the end of the incubation period, we had large numbers of chicks on each of the floating platforms. So this is what one of the platforms full of the eggs and the young running around just before fledging. And so this is sort of the history of the common terns there at the Naval Station, Great Lakes. And we had those years of high success early on. We felt that PCB contamination really was detrimental to the success of that population. Once the PCBs were under control, we reestablished the nesting on those floating platforms. And last year we were extremely successful with the number of young produced. And we've actually purchased and constructed another platform. So we'll have additional platforms out in the harbor this year. The least tern, again, this is another endangered species in Illinois. It's also federally listed. They really are closely associated, unlike the Foster's terns that are inland, associated with large fresh water. These are actually associated with the sandbars with some of the large river systems. And so unfortunately, what happens is you think about the river systems when they go through their flood period, and then during the drought period, these large sandbars are established in these rivers. And that's what these terns really focus on, the establishment of these sandbars within the rivers. So again, it's both a state and federally listed species with declining populations throughout its distribution. And we felt that there was West Alton was an ideal location for a tern conservation project, because we had the Illinois, Missouri, and the Mississippi rivers all come together. And so we wanted to see if we could use that conspecific attraction to yet again see if we could enhance some of the survivalship of nesting terns. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was a wonderful partner to work with. They had these big barges that they no longer were using, and we retrofitted them to put sand on top of the barges and put them out in the, again, we put out these conspecific calls using the recorders. And this is a nice little bay just off of the main river that the Army Corps could maintain, have access, restrict access for boating and interference from boats. And so this was just a few days after the terns came back into the area. Again, you can see these are actually decoys. The terns out there are all decoys, and trying to establish, attract the birds. And so very successful in that first year. The birds found that location, laid eggs and nested successfully. In subsequent years, we've had black-crowned night herons going after the young. We've had great blue herons going after the young, and we've had actually a raccoon that swam out into the middle of this large inlet, climbed up the chain and ate most of the eggs that remain. So even out on a floating island in the middle of the Mississippi River, we have challenges of mammalian predators. But the birds continue to be successful, and it's a wonderful place. There's some observation decks there to watch these birds where they're nesting down in West Alton. And again, consistent with what we've done in the past, we try to color band these birds to see where they show up and down the river. The last tern that we talk about tonight is the black tern. And again, very similar to the Forster's tern, these birds are found throughout the large freshwater lakes and ponds in the central part of the United States. They lay very simple nests, basically pull up a little floating vegetation, and their eggs can be actually just floating on the surface of the water and actually in the water at times, depending on how well the nest has been constructed. But those nests are very close to the surface of the water and subject to wave action from wind. And so some of the efforts that we've taken, again, working with the Boy Scouts and Eagle Scouts, have constructed some of these floating platforms and basically put those out. There historically, when we did some surveys of Northeast Illinois wetland birds, there was up to 14 different colonies in Northeast Illinois, and we're down to only four known colonies at this time. And so it's very discouraging to see the numbers of birds that are, or the number of active colonies. But in those colonies, we're doing our best to put out these floating platforms to try to protect the nest from any kind of wave damage. And McHenry County Conservation District has put out some of these. And some of the challenges are that the muskrats end up using those to pile the vegetation up. And some of the other areas that we've used them on Red-winged Slough, again, we've had some problems with muskrats, but it seems to be very effective where the birds are nesting on the edge of the vegetation where they're subject to the wave action. So I guess that's the end of the four species of terns. Again, I don't want to end on a down note, but there's been lots of ups and downs as we watch these birds, and this has really been a partnership of a lot of people that have helped out over the years of helping to monitor and assist in this tern conservation. So with that, turn over to any questions or back to Matt if there's a way to run through questions.
Yeah. There's at least there's one question that just came in, so I can ask that. So Rich was asking, so around 1980, there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of common and Forster's terns on the docks at Montrose, maybe like early May, late April. Is there any information on where those birds were going and like why they're no longer seeing them in those numbers along Montrose?
Yeah, I think again, Montrose as for species of terns as well as land birds, that it's a great place to concentrate on migrating as they're heading north. It's a real focal point for migration where the birds are finding a place to forage and sort of congregate and establish some pair bonds before they're heading north. But I think most of those species are going to go up to some of the larger lakes in Wisconsin and over in Minnesota. So it's more of I wouldn't call it necessarily a staging ground, but definitely an area where the birds are concentrated on their migration as they're headed north.
Yeah, and I would say, like, as someone who's, further south at the tip of Lake Michigan, if you go to places that are in Indiana, like Miller Beach, you do see big groups of these terns moving through, and it could be that they're just offshore and they're not stopping like in places where people can see them, like they used to. Like probably they don't stay at Montrose if there's a lot of like human activity. They just they might be flying by. I don't know. But yeah, you can see good concentrations in Indiana, usually at Miller Beach. Usually is a good place that's not too far from Chicago. We have another question. Are there any genetic studies being done on any of the 4 species?
Not that I'm, well, actually, I take the least tern, there have been some recent genetic studies trying to figure out whether the coastal and the inland species or they want to combine those as one or whether they're separate. So there are some recent studies looking at genetics on the least terns. So I think we were doing some work with a Midwest species of greatest concern, and there's a little bit of consternation of what to do with the least tern just because of the status of some of the genetics and whether they're going to split or lump those birds in the coastal or the inland.
Then I had a couple questions. So I know just very minor, but like the common tern one, you had the floating docks, but it still had fencing around it. Was that to keep chicks in, or was that to keep things out still?
Yeah, that's those docks are out in the harbor to keep them away from the mammalian predators, and so we're just keeping them on the dock until they're old enough to fledge. So they're if they fell off, that dock has to be, it's about a 2 feet of freeboard to keep the waves from washing over and washing the sand off. So if once they get off, then they're not able to get back on. So we just put that fence around and keep them on until they're old enough to actually fly off the dock.
And then I guess one thing I was thinking, it's probably more of a just like a philosophical thing, but like as water recedes again, like the water levels I think are kind of starting to trend back down again for Lake Michigan. Do you think some of these colonies will come back? That, like, you know, I don't know, is it historical for them to move around a little anyway because probably lake levels went up and down? I mean, what should we expect, do you think?
Well, I think any time that humans get involved, I think we mess things up. And even though it's our best intentions, I think, for instance, like the least tern, the hydrograph of the Mississippi River is actually totally backwards. It should be, you know, these droughty conditions, there should be exposed sandbars, you get flood conditions, and literally the sandbars are moving constantly. But what they try to do, they keep the rivers up in the middle of the summers for barge traffic, and then they lower it during the winter when they don't want ice damage. And so the hydrograph is actually backwards. And so when you have these least terns are nesting in the same islands because you're not getting these major flood events, then the predators seem to hone in on them. So if you had flooding events and the islands are moving, the predators aren't going back to the same location. And I think that was what's happening to the colony of the common terns, that they're historically, and this is a very long-lived species. So if you're nesting for 5 or 6 years and you don't have any successful offspring, then that's okay, because you're living for 25 years and you have lots of times to try to get success to replace yourself. So these are very long-lived birds, and their colonies do have years of boom and bust. And so probably what they're doing is they historically would have moved up and down the lakeshore. When a predator found, you know, where they're nesting, they wipe them out and then they'll move somewhere else. But they just don't have that many places to nest anymore. Every time they go someplace, there's this recreational conflicts with humans. The lake levels are high, and so any of the nesting islands or the width of the shorelines where they might have nested is very restricted. So these birds are, would ecologically go through these times of boom and bust where they might get really good nesting years and some years that aren't. And we're trying to manage for that and try to keep the nesting colonies going year after year without introducing the problems of predation. And so the common terns at Naval Station Great Lakes, we actually have to live trap the great horned owls every year and move them out because they come in and wipe them out. So because they're in the same place every year. So when these predators learn where they're nesting, they come in but if they don't have multiple places to nest and move around, then there's this constant conflict between the predators learning where they are and the birds not being successful.
Yeah, I think, that's a really good point too, because I feel like a lot of times, you know, my day job as an educator and talking about like how like a lot of these systems are not static. You know, I think we always think of like, oh yeah, like it's a forest and this is this, and And so like Lakeshore is very dynamic. And so, yeah, historically, you know, it's supposed to change a lot, but we always want to make it like stay the same, you know, and build something. And so that really kind of messes up all those birds' behaviors for sure. I see another question from Eden about the river otter. So it looks like their population is increasing. Do you think they're a potential threat for the terns?
Oh, I don't hear about, you know, I know they've they've really impacted some of our mussel reintroduction projects for sure. So we've got these endangered species of endangered mussels trying to reintroduce, and they can really wipe out the mussels. They're very efficient at hunting for mussels. I don't know. They are very opportunistic. I think if they came across a young tern or something on the edge of the water or some eggs in the water, they likely would go for it because they're omnivores. But I don't know if they're necessarily a major concern at this point.
Numbers probably aren't as high as skunks and raccoons and everything else. Yeah. Yeah. Any other last questions from anybody? I don't see any other ones in the chat here. Okay. Well, thanks, Brad, for talking to us about terns. Hopefully that gives some people ideas of places where you can go see them. So yeah, if someone wanted to go see the terns, can they see these colonies from shore, like up north?
Unfortunately, after 9/11, my great tern monitor and mentor, Donnie Dan, he's been persistent for years trying to get a pass to get onto the base, and some years he gets it and some years he doesn't. And it's a real challenge. Before 9/11, we had some field trips up there and people got to see them. And unfortunately, I think at this time there's still the restrictions are pretty hard to get on base unless anybody's here with the military, then they can get on. But unfortunately not. But if you just go north or south of the military base, the birds are foraging up and down the shoreline. So there's a good chance of seeing them as they move along up Waukegan Harbor or south down to the Fort Sheridan, those areas of beach. They can usually see them moving up and down the shoreline.
Well, thanks, Brad. I'm gonna end our recording here.
Okay.